Georgia won the whole thing last year. And they're playing for a bowl game, yes, in the playoff, and they're excited for that, I'm sure, in the Peach Bowl. Like, that's great. But they're worried about the national title. They're looking to repeat. Because last year's team got the championship belt for the first time in a really long time, got the championship belt. But as I watched them win the SEC title against LSU this past weekend, I just couldn't help but start to think to myself, is this team in 2022 potentially better than they were in 2021? And I'm not talking about the defense. I'm not talking about, just that side of the football. I'm talking about the entire operation. Offense, defense, special teams, coaching staff. Like, are they better? And I think there's some, research that I think it's worth a second look, I guess is what I'm trying to tell you. And the reason why I lean a little bit more towards them being better in 2022 is because of the maturation and development of Stetson Bennett. Stetson Bennett up for the Heisman Trophy, along with Max Duggan and Caleb Williams and C.J. Stroud. Like, he's up for the Heisman. I get that, and I think that's actually deserved. Maybe it's unpopular, maybe it isn't. He's no longer the Achilles heel of this program. How often did we hear week in and week out last year, can you force Stetson Bennett to beat you? Can you make it be on 13 shoulders to beat you? And quite frankly, it wasn't really on his shoulders that much last year because you had a generational defense. And so then that conversation carried into this year. He's a walk-on. He's surrounded by a lot of talent. Can you make it be Stetson Bennett's game? And week after week, teams have made it Stetson Bennett's game, and he's just beating them. Georgia's throwing it over 30 times a game. They're putting on his shoulders to go and beat the opposition. You can now, as a Georgia football team, win games because of Stetson Bennett. No longer are you winning in spite of Stetson Bennett. Georgia is winning because of Stetson Bennett. And I think that's really important to look at as you're comparing these teams, because think about the kind of games that Georgia could win last year in terms of styles of fights. It was the defense just forces you to submit. Heck, they may score points on defense. And then Stetson Bennett will hand it off. He'll throw some check downs to Brock Bowers. He'll get the ball in space to playmakers, get out of his hands quick. And, one thing will lead to another. Georgia will eventually wear you out. Well, now I saw an SEC title game where LSU threw for 500-plus yards. And Georgia never was out of control in that game. There was never a question in my mind if Georgia would win that football game after they ran back that field goal. It was, okay, Georgia's in front, Georgia's in the lead, Georgia's going to win this game. It took 50 to do it, but they ultimately got it done. And I don't know that last year's team would have been able to play that style of ball. Now, to be fair, I don't know if last year's team would have had 500 yards hung on them in the past game, but you hear what I'm saying here. The styles of fights now that Georgia is able to win and able to make you play, I think is a little bit more dangerous than just that one submission move they had a year ago. Now, last year's submission move was good enough for a national title. Let's not get it twisted. But the reality is Georgia's more dangerous because of Stetson Bennett's maturation and his development as a quarterback and a leader for this football team. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, we'd love to have you at the party. We've had, Nick, probably over 2,000 of you in the last 3 weeks from the Georgia faithful join the party. We want you here. We want you a part of the party. If you haven't yet subscribed and joined us, we'd love to have you. No time like the present, right? The transfer portal's heating up. Your dogs are chasing another national title. Come get on board. Come have a good time with us. Also, follow me on the social channels at JD Piquel on Twitter and on Instagram. A lot of interaction there that we incorporate into this program. What I said there about Stetson Bennett improving as a quarterback is important, but I think him improving as a leader is also important. And the reason why I would continue to protest that I think Georgia is better than they were a season ago, even though they got a national title last year, is they have experience at places that experience really matters. And on defense, they got like 8 new starters, and 3 of those starters that were returning, one of them was Nolan Smith, and he's no longer playing, so pencil them in for 9 new starters, I suppose. Guys that had played before, but being starters for this team is, a different kind of role to be played. And so that was kind of the question going into the year, was how will those guys do? Well, the defense has been phenomenal, so they haven't really missed too much of a beat there. But like I said, experience where experience matters, I think you really start to see that show in these higher stakes kind of games. Not that they aren't all high stakes, but especially in the SEC title, we get into the playoff, we get into the national championship, you have guys in Kirby Smart, Todd Monken, Stetson Bennett, that have all been there before. they're not going to get to that stage and get stage fright or be like a deer in the headlights or be like, oh my gosh, this moment's too big. No, they're the most high impact spots on your team as the head coach, OC, and quarterback, and there's a steady hand. That's kind of the reality for Georgia. And quite frankly, I think that's really important as they continue to chase that national title, because experience is something that you can't go out and just plug and play. You can go and get experience from the portal, but to have experience on the biggest stages, that's a little bit more rare and more difficult to find. And so for this Georgia team, especially for the positions that I just mentioned, especially at quarterback, coach, and offensive coordinator, to have experience there and to have been in the bright lights, I think will really serve them well and cause them to be less volatile than maybe they were a year ago in that national title spot and in the SEC title game, obviously, and then in the playoff. I'm excited to see it. I'm just saying, I think that makes them more dangerous, does that experience factor, experience where it matters. Now, here's the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to Georgia being better than they were in 2021. Anytime you win a national title or do anything of note from the year before, there's always that question around the fan base, and maybe it's internally as well, and coaches try to fend it off, is there going to be a hangover? Will this team be complacent? Will they get fat and happy and just kind of rest on the laurels of what they actually didn't do, but it was last year's team that did it? This Georgia team, I can say emphatically, there's none of that. There's no complacency. In fact, you could argue they have upped the ante a little bit, because so much of this Georgia team, so much of it is trying to one-up last year's team. And the term that I would put to it is like a brother syndrome, not a little brother syndrome, but maybe like a twin brother syndrome, if you will. You don't want to have your accomplishments, you don't want to have your accolades associated so much with your brother. You want to be your own person. You want to be your own team. That's great your brother won a national title. Well, guess what? I'm trying to win a national title, and I'm trying to do it in a different way than he did it. I mean, that's great. They won the national title. They win the SEC. We did. Our 2022 team did. How about that? Being dominant, being consistent in a different way than last year's team was, I think drives this program. And you're at the point now where talent in the playoff, Georgia's probably the most talented team, you could argue, but it becomes less and less of a gap. Like if Georgia lines up against Michigan or Ohio State or, I mean, heck, let's just throw TCU in there. The talent gap likely won't be as much of a determining factor. Now it'll still be it'll still be relevant, but I don't think it'll be quite as noticeable as it has before. So when you get to that point where talent isn't quite as noticeable, guess what pays the bills? It's culture and it's edge. And I think this team, in some ways, in spite of last year, have a desire to up the ante and play with more edge. And that's really, I think, kind of the fire internally. The hunger internally, which is what I think makes them more dangerous and potentially makes them better than they were even a season ago, which is saying something as that team won the national title. So for Georgia, Stetson Bennett up in his game, you now can win different styles of games, and you no longer have the conversation around, well, can you make Stetson Bennett beat you? That's so worn out. That's so old. And newsflash, if you make Stetson Bennett beat you, he's proven many a time he will. They're mature where it counts, mature where you need to be mature. A lot of newness on defense. That's great. Those guys have played well, and they're not playing like they're new guys, but the maturity in the big stages is going to be crucial, and they have that at quarterback, at OC, and at head coach. Positions of impact especially, they have that, and they have it in spades. Then finally, the edge of this team. The hunger, the culture, the desire within this team. Stuff that you can't totally quantify, stuff that you can't really watch on tape and break down to the nth degree and really diagnose scientifically. I think Georgia has that. And I think we're going to really get to see that show itself when the talent gap becomes less and Georgia continues to throttle forward. So for Georgia, the mission is still the same, to win a national title, to repeat and all that. But I'm just saying, I think this year's Georgia team is more dangerous than the team we saw a season ago. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.